This is a particularly personal piece. It's a conversation we hosted in the digital campfire with the addictions expert Gabor Maté. And it's personal because it's sparked by a Substack piece that I wrote about my relationship with my mother and her recovery from addiction. The piece went out on Substack a few weeks ago. If you haven't read it, I would suggest maybe you stop this and read it. I'm going to put the link in the show notes below. It touches on many of the issues that come up with addiction. How much are we able to help versus how much must the addict help themselves? The nature of self-deception and delusion, what obligations we have to our parents, and all the other moral dilemmas we have to deal with the topic of addiction. And the piece really seemed to strike a chord with a lot of people who've been suffering with addiction or had family members who've been suffering with addiction, which is why it felt right to share and also to host this conversation with Gabor Maté. And I'm putting this out on the channel now after I've checked in with all the people who are featured in it to just check that they are okay with their personal sharings being shared more widely. So I hope you find this useful. So yeah, welcome everybody to a really special Thursday evening session on the topic of addiction and recovery. And I guess everyone here has read the piece that I wrote last week about kind of my journey with it, which is the first time I've shared that publicly. So yeah, Gabor, thank you so much. I reached out to you. I can't think of anyone I'd rather have here, and I'm so privileged that I had your email address, and when I messaged you, you were available at this late notice. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
I think your framing of addiction is in a way not the problem for the addict. Addiction is the solution.
In a temporary sense.
Yeah.
In a temporary, it becomes a problem, but it starts off as a solution. Yes.
Could you say more about that?
Well, whenever I give a talk on addiction, I will give my definition of addiction. So I'll do so now. And an addiction is manifested in any behavior in which a person finds temporary pleasure or relief and therefore craves, but sustains negative consequences in the long term and cannot give it up despite those negative consequences. So that's an addiction. Craving pleasure, relief in the short term, harm in the long term to oneself and others, and inability or refusal to give it up, or difficulty giving up. That's what an addiction is. Now, let's just do a experiment here. Those of you that, based on that, by the way, notice that I said nothing about substances. So the addiction could be to drugs or alcohol or nicotine or caffeine, heroin, of course, whatever. It could also be to sex, gambling, shopping, eating, pornography, internet gaming, the internet itself, work, any human activity. The issue is not the external target, but the internal relationship. If there's pleasure, relief, and craving in the short term, harm in the long term, difficulty giving up, I don't care what the behavior is, you got an addiction. So that's my definition. So what I'll ask is, what I often do is when I give this talk, just people who are listening on this talk, if you recognize that one time or another, you've had an addictive pattern in your life, and I don't care what it is, I'm not going to ask you, but if you had any kind of an addictive pattern in your life, just raise your hands, okay? If you recognize it in yourself. Okay, now, usually we have, most people put their hands up, and then there's a few liars who don't, but that's how it works. So now what I'm going to ask you is not what you're addicted to, but when, or for how long, I don't care. But whatever it was, what did it do for you in the short term? Now, what is the chat line open?
Yes, the chat box is open. It's on.
Okay, well, what about if some people wrote in, what did it do for you in the short term that you liked? What did you appreciate about your addiction? I know there was harm. Okay, it relieved uncomfortable emotions, somebody said. What else? Relief, again. Relief, it relieved the pain. Escape. When do people need escape? It's when they're suffering. Pain is suffering. Escapism again. Access to happiness. disconnect from life. Okay, good. Takes the edge off. Let's stop here because I have enough here.
Hmm.
Take the edge off what? Take the edge off your suffering. Why would you need to escape life when life is unbearable? In other words, addictions are always an attempt to deal with pain, hence my mantra. Don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain. And if you have to look at why the pain, you have to look at people's lives. In other words, people's traumas. And in my view, well, not just in my view, according to every reasonable piece of evidence, that trauma is usually incurred in childhood, whether people know that or not. So what I'm saying is that addictions are like pain relief. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Happiness, good thing or a bad thing? Connection with other people, or is that a good thing or a bad thing? Inner peace, stress relief, are they good or bad? They're wonderful. We all want them. That's how we just want to be normal human beings. So the addictive drive is really an attempt to regulate unbearable emotions, and those unbearable emotions are rooted in childhood experience. So the addiction is not the primary problem. The addiction is the attempt to solve a problem. And the source of that problem resides in people's life experience.
Before we go to the breakouts, Gabor, I want to ask your thoughts on the dynamic that I noticed coming up again and again in the relationship with addiction that I wrote about, is this relationship to the ego and the sense of the belief that we've got this, that we can cope, seems to be one of the major blocks. And I guess that's why it's at the core of the 12-step program of kind of like the first step is recognizing that we don't have control over it.
Yeah.
What that feels like a deeply kind of spiritual, deeply religious perspective of kind of recognizing our limitations and giving ourselves up to a higher power. Could you reflect on that? Like what is that dynamic?
Well, the ego is not who we are. The ego is something that we come to identify with as being who we are. But the ego, for the most part, represents our coping mechanisms and our desperation to be in charge. Why do we have that desperation to be in charge? Because when we weren't, when we were very small, we suffered. So the ego is largely a response to suffering, and it wants to be in control. And even when it's destroying you, it still wants to believe that it's in control and that you don't have a problem. So the essence of ego is denial, and denial of its own, denial of the pain that gave rise to it. Now, of course, as any spiritual tradition, whether Eastern or Western, Southern or Northern, will tell you, we are not the little ego. We're not that little self isolated from the universe. We're actually connected and part of a much greater whole. In fact, the big whole, WHOLE, that's what we're a part of, and a manifestation and a representation of. But for the ego to recognize that is to give up its own legitimacy in its own existence. So the ego fights that spiritual realization. So when people go through these spiritual experiences through meditation or spiritual practices, Sufi whirling, or through psychedelics, Christian contemplation, the dark night of the soul, as St. John of the Cross puts it, you know, the ego suffers an ego death. It goes through this little death. But because the ego identifies itself with us, we're afraid that if the ego dies, we die. So recognizing that we're powerless is actually a spiritual step. It says, yeah, you know what? I get it. My little ego is just not sufficient to answer my life dilemma. And I need to appeal to a higher power. However you wish to define that. Now, the 12-step groups traditionally have identified it with the Christian derived God being, which is fine if it works for you, but it doesn't have to be that. But generally, recognizing that higher power does mean a humbling of the ego. So the ego is put in its place. I don't mean in a negative sense, but in a positive sense. Oh yeah, okay, I'm not in charge. And if I want to move forward, I have to align with something that's beyond me, which is itself is a spiritual step. Whether the person experiences it or defines it as spiritual, that's what it is.
So I'd love to, I'd love to open this conversation up. So I would like to open up the breakout rooms. Awesome. I think we're all back. So yeah, I'd love to hear if anyone feels that they want to share anything that they shared, or any sort of common themes that came up in their breakout rooms. Let's begin a sort of more open conversation. And please, use the chat as well for something if you want to share. But if you want to raise your hand, the raise hand function is probably in the reactions tab at the bottom of your screen. So Leilani, do you like to share first? You're muted, Leilani. Leilani, you're muted.
Sorry. Okay, thank you. I just wanted to say, I was really, first of all, David, I was really touched by what you wrote, and very appreciative. And my own experience, just to speak to that for a moment, is that especially the most poignant part is that my youngest daughters are recovering addicts. And my youngest daughter was actually in prison for a while because of her addiction, as a result of her addiction. And it was in prison that she received the most intensive therapy. We did family therapy there. We did, she did individual therapy. We did group therapy. And it was in that process that she started to do her recovery and has stayed clean and sober since then. And I don't think I would have ever said that being in prison would be a good thing to happen. And it was, to me, it was the best thing that ever happened for her and for us, because it was the path to healing that started to take place for the trauma that she experienced and that I experienced as well. Yeah.
Wow, thank you for sharing that, Leilani. Yeah, it's amazing, this topic. I mean, you've been part of our community for an awfully long time, and I've never heard that story. It's amazing that this topic can bring up some real, we can really connect with each other from this space. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mark.
Hi, thanks. So, first of all, just to say, David, also I read your piece and thank you for that. I really appreciated it. I suppose my question was just touching on something that Gabor was saying beforehand. We were talking about the 12 steps, and particularly step 1 and 2, so the powerlessness and then the higher power. I mean, I have to say, I really struggle with those, in particular the powerlessness idea. I don't feel powerless at all. And I totally accept that I can't impact everything. I'm not, but to use a Viveki line, I am an agent in the arena. I can do things. And similarly, as regards to the higher power, I totally accept that there are things that are out of my control, and there's sort of society, etc., around it. But I'm an atheist. So I don't believe in God, and all of that sort of side of things I find difficult. And but particularly step 1, this powerlessness idea. I mean, we're not powerless. It's just not correct. So I'd just be interested in, which is not to say that we're all powerful either.
Mark, are you open to a conversation about this?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, good. So first of all, thank you. I get what you're saying. And of course, ultimately, we're not powerless. If we were, we might as well not do the 12 steps or do anything, right? So I agree with you. However, I'm not sure that's what the 12-step statement indicates. They're talking about the addicted state. In that addicted state, are you freely choosing to engage in your addiction, whether it's a substance or behavior, or are you being driven to it by some internal dynamics? Which is it for you? in
Yeah,
that.
if you're
in that-
distinguishing between the addicted state, the moment when I do something that I kind of wish I wasn't doing, which
Yeah.
for me is largely overeating. Yeah, in that moment, that is true. That you know, I'm doing something I don't want to do. That's so. If we're defining it in that narrow sense, yes,
That's what they're talking about.
right, okay,
I believe that's what they're talking about. Number one. Number two, the resistance to this idea of powerlessness itself is interesting, because here's my guess. It's not my guess. It's an educated opinion. With myself or with any other addicted person I've ever met, there was a time when one was really powerless and suffering as a result of that powerlessness, because things happened to one to hurt us,
yeah,
over which we had no power. So therefore, the very idea of powerlessness emotionally resonates with that helpless, suffering state. So again, that I'm powerless, that refers to the addicted state. It's not an overall true statement about any human being. I agree with you, but
Yeah.
it is very specific to that state. Number one. Number two, the fear of acknowledging is itself a marker of trauma, is what I'm saying.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's probably fair to say that I had some sort of traumatic events in my past, and I kind of accept that. But if and I think the way you framed it is a useful way of thinking about it. But then I would say we need to rephrase step 1 of the 12 steps to make it a bit clearer.
Well, fair enough. I mean, I think there's a lot of things about the 12 steps that I'd love to reframe. In fact, in my book on addiction, I have created an appendix where I reframe the 12 steps in language that makes sense to me. And I think we can all do that for ourselves.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Robin Cressman.
Yes, thank you. Our small breakout group was just so enlightening, and it's what's heartening to know is just how many different ways addiction touches people's lives through our own experience, through our family experience, and how many different shades of addiction there are, whether that's substance or behavior. And I've been in 12-step programs myself many times for many different rooms, and there is something so powerful about the circle, about sharing, about hearing other people's stories, about sharing your own story that is fortifying. But one question to float to Gabor, as you say, you've gone through having to work through a lot of this type of emotional entanglement with your wife. I'm curious if you and your wife enlisted an outside therapist, or if this was just internal work that you both were committed to that helped you walk through that, and or
both actually. I mean, there was a time when we saw a very good family therapist. We both had therapy individually, because it's not just about the relationship, it's also about ourselves as undifferentiated people. I've done a lot of work on that. I've also worked with psychedelics, both as a provider, but also as a participant. And then I'm married to a woman with whom we just do a lot of deep conversation, sometimes at the most difficult times. Because I hate to tell you, but we always hook up with somebody exactly at the same level of trauma as we're at. So it's always two people at the same level of trauma in a relationship. That means that the relationship itself could be a wonderful training ground and a ground for growth, or it can be a shipwreck, depending on how people relate to the trauma that they bring into the relationship. We've been fortunate that way. So yeah, that's our story.
It's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yossarian.
Hi.
Hi. Now, before you ask a question, can I ask you something?
Sure.
Yossarian, were you named after a character in Cash 22?
Yes, I was.
Isn't that something?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I was really touched by your article, David. My mom was deep in alcoholism and has been sober for 11 years now. And she just lost her husband this past year. And I'm almost crying right now. Just really proud of her that she didn't relapse into addiction when she lost her husband, and just kind of shows how much work she's done. And I too have had long bouts with addiction, and did a number of years of weekly therapy, somatic work, energy work, breath work, and then drinking ayahuasca in the jungles of Peru, I think where your daughter has worked, Gabor, at the Temple of Way of Light.
Former daughter-in-law.
Former daughter-in-law, I apologize.
Okay. That's okay.
And yeah, I mean, just interesting, when I first quit doing hard drugs, it was 2008. It was actually right when my birth father passed. And so if that was at least the first, longer bout with quitting. But what I brought up in the group, and I guess as part of the question for me, was that, it's felt to me, being interested in this subject quite a bit, both personally and tons of friends, and just seeing how much suffering is in the world, and we know kind of the statistics on how effective AA is, which is not super effective. And maybe it's due to those, how we interpret being powerless, et cetera. But I felt like, Gabor, you've been at the cutting edge of what addiction really is about. And there's a number of modalities tools that you can use to face recovery. And I've mentioned some of those, but it still feels to me like the vast majority of recovery treatment are not at that cutting edge level. And I guess I'm curious if you'd speak a little bit about how well you see these different modalities being adopted, from somatic type of work and kind of trauma related work, and ayahuasca and dealing with some of those things. So that's, I guess, my question.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, look, if you took your car to a mechanic that didn't understand how a car works, you wouldn't expect too many good results. And most addiction programs don't understand addiction. They see it either as a choice that somebody makes, or more likely, they see it as a disease of the brain that somebody inherited largely, or for some reason developed. They don't get that it's all rooted in trauma. Now, if you don't deal with the trauma, you're not dealing with fundamental causes, you're dealing with effects. So addiction is an effect, it's a symptom. It also generates more symptoms, but at heart, as I was saying earlier, it's an attempted solution to the problem of human suffering, which itself is rooted in trauma. Therefore, if you don't address the trauma, you're just not going to get anywhere. And this is where the 12 steps founder, they're great, the 12 steps. As I was saying in a small group, everybody in the world could benefit from doing the 12 steps, addicted or not. Imagine a world where Boris Johnson and Vladimir Putin and Joseph Biden all did the 12 steps and did moral inventory on the stuff they done to other people. We'd be living in a much better world. But what the 12-step community, by and large, doesn't recognize is the traumatic nature and origin of addiction. Therefore, they can only take people so far. Some people, they really works for. It could work for many more people if they were to incorporate trauma awareness into their processes. And the same thing is true. The medical profession, the average medical doctor does not get a single lecture on trauma in all their years of training. If you can believe it, they don't. So how are they to deal with all the physical and emotional manifestations of trauma, of which addiction is one? So they're just not trained for it. It's not part of their perspective. So if you don't have the eyes to see, you're not going to see, and they don't have the eyes to see. So those modalities that do incorporate some trauma awareness, like internal family systems, like my compassionate inquiry approach, like genuine ayahuasca experiences, psychedelic healing that is infused with a trauma perspective, like somatic experiencing of Peter Levine, like sensory motor reprogramming, any number of modalities that do have trauma awareness are essential aspects of any addiction healing program. And when you, even the word recovery itself, if you just meditate on that for a moment, the essence of trauma is disconnection from the self. That's the essence of trauma. And in my new book, which is called The Myth of Normal, out in September, I talk about that in great detail. So the essence of trauma is disconnection from the self. When we talk about recovery, what does the word recovery mean? It means to find something that you've lost. So you recover it. When you talk to people in recovery, what have you found? They'll say, I found myself. And so it's that search for the self, the full self, both in the physical, emotional, and spiritual sense. That's the essence of recovery. And unless the addiction programs incorporate how that self was lost in the first place, which is trauma, they're naturally going to be inadequate. They're just going to manage behaviors, but they're not dealing with the primary dynamic.
Thank you. Just follow up there. It feels, I mean, I'm kind of in a bubble of people who do the type of work you're talking about, and it feels like it's growing, maybe not exponentially, but it's growing quite a bit. But do you, I mean, I guess the question I'm really trying to get at is, do you see that like 5% of the recovery, quote unquote, world is kind of moving in your direction? Are we anywhere close to that? Is it expanding in a way that you see that we're going to be better off, or are we?
I don't know. I don't know how to quantify that. What I can tell you is that trauma awareness in society is growing. There's this book here called What Happened to You by Dr. Bruce Perry, written with Oprah, all about not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you, all about childhood trauma and its manifestations. There are my books, published in 30 languages. The new one, which is out in the fall, has already been bought in 21 languages around the world. Bessel van der Kolk's wonderful text, or wonderful public book on trauma, The Body Keeps the Score, international and New York Times #1 bestseller for years upon years now. This indicates a sea change in society's awareness of trauma. That sea change has not penetrated the official institutions, like the medical faculties and the academic institutions so much, and certainly not government policy, but it is changing. People are coming more on board, whether it's 5% or 7.5%. I don't have the means to quantify it. What I can say is there's an encouraging awareness on the part of more and more people, and in the face of a lot of official resistance.
I was interested in that topic as well, Gabor, because it does feel like there has been a big shift in the conversation, or there's a growing shift in the direction of your work and your understanding. I think the book that came out by Johan Hari was sort of very much along those similar lines. It does feel to me like the conversation is moving in that direction. And I wonder where you feel, whether you're seeing the same thing from your perspective.
Well, it so happens I was speaking to Johan just this morning in another event. Well, as I say, the indications are that, it's changing. The public interest is changing on the part of a significant minority. I think it's going to take a long time. But it's very encouraging how far it's come in the last 10 years.
Yeah, I want to say thank you to everybody. Beautiful sharings from everyone. And I'd like to say a special thank you to Carl. Carl, just before this, Carl is a friend of mine who I'm going for a beer with after this. Carl, do you want to say something, and you'll pop to the front of everyone's screen? You're gonna have to unmute yourself.
Are we allowed to go for a beer after that? I'm not sure if that's the done thing, David.
just the one.
Just the one.
So yeah, because I thank you, Carl, because just before this, Carl is a very close friend who said, "Oh, I want to be there for you," and that was really touching. Thank you, Carl, and thank you for being there for me over the last years.
Thank you for sharing it with me, Dave. You've been a wonderful friend, and you've made your journey something of use to other people. And I think that's a real gift to be able to do. You're a good man.
Yeah, and I want to acknowledge the support that I've had as well, that has been invaluable in the journey with my mother and everything kind of that's unfolded over the last years, which has been an insane amount to handle, but has actually been the most incredible transformational process as well in my growth. So yeah, thank you, Carl, and other friends for being there. Genevieve, who's here somewhere as well, who my ex-housemate. And there she is. You know, unmute yourself, Genevieve. In my old kitchen.
Oh gosh, yeah. I'm in 99, back in the old ward.
Yeah, that's the house I lived in for 12 years that we turned into a pop-up restaurant and all sorts. And yeah, and so many, and also thank you to so many of the previous members like Adriana and Nick coming back for this session. And I really feel the emotional resonance of this topic. And yeah, I really feel the value of opening up these spaces. And I would love to do more of this sort of really heartful space. And yeah, most of all, Gabor, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for all of the amazing work and the dedication that you have that I can see, and the dedication you have to others and helping others. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. If I may mention, those of you that are in London or near it, on June the 13th, I'll be in a public event on how we can transform trauma into wisdom. And I don't have the website here, but you can look at my website or find it. It'll be the evening of June the 13th. In London somewhere.
Yeah, I'll send that. I'll make sure I send that out to our mailing list, Gabor. I'll send out a special message to our mailing list. So if you just get in touch with me on email, I'll make sure that we share it.
And then I'll be back again in October when the book actually comes out, and there'll be some public events. So listen, thank you. It's such a pleasure to work with you, David, and all of you that shared so openly. It's always an honor to connect with real human beings.
Thank you, Gabor. And as we traditionally do at the end of these calls, if everyone would like to unmute themselves, we'll just say thank you and goodbye until next time.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Thank you.